From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Let me take you back to last summer. In the early hours of July the 5th, history was being made in Britain.
And we can now say with certainty that Labour have won the 2024 general election. As I speak, they have gained 326 seats. It's now 327. The size of the majority is still to be determined as the results continue to come in. But what a moment this is for Labour.
And there is Sir Keir Starmer, who will become Britain's 58th Prime Minister.
You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, was beaming as he addressed the jubilant crowd. But in private, just a few minutes earlier, it was a very different scene.
Well, it's 3:30 on the 5th of July, and Keir Starmer has spent 6 weeks on the road, going from marginal constituency to marginal constituency, geeing up the faithful and campaigning in the country where Morgan McSweeney, who was then Labour's campaign director, the aide he had turned to many, many years before in the summer of 2019 to make him leader of the Labour Party, has been slaving away in Labour HQ for 6 weeks. Morgan McSweeney rang him just after the exit poll as he was smoking a cigar on the balcony of Labour HQ and said, "Congratulations, you're the next Prime Minister." They finally reunite at the Tate where Labour's victory party is being held. And they walk into a lift up to, I think it was the 7th floor, where there was a big party in Starmer's honour. And the first thing they talk about is the scale of the majority. And Morgan McSweeney says to Keir Starmer, "We're going to have a 3-figure majority, but we're just 1 or 2 seats short of Tony Blair's majority in 1997. And at that point, both men do something strange. They start berating themselves. They are really, really, really annoyed. You know, this should be such a cathartic and happy moment, but all they can do is beat themselves up. And they talk about how annoying it is. And at that moment, the third person in the lift, Victoria Starmer, Lady Starmer, Keir Starmer's wife, tells them they're being ridiculous and that they need to stop having this ridiculous conversation. And I think that sort of sums up both men. Intensely competitive, never satisfied, always wanting to push further. That is the Labour Party in this period in many ways. You have Keir Starmer, his wife, who is a source of private counsel, the person he values more than any colleague, and then Morgan McSweeney, the man to whom he's turned time and time again to solve political problems, to make him Prime Minister. And even though he's fulfilled it, neither man is quite satisfied in that moment. I think it's such a telling vignette about both men.
What's happening behind the scenes in Starmer's number 10? Who really wields power? And what are the tensions that threaten to pull the project apart? The story today. Who's really in charge of Labour and the country?
My name's Patrick Maguire. I am a political columnist for The Times. You can also hear me regularly on Times Radio. And every week in The Times, I write about Keir Starmer's Labour Party. That is basically my job on the paper, and that's a job I've been doing for a couple of years now, off the back of the book Gabriel and I wrote, 5 years ago now, about Jeremy Corbyn's not rise to power, fall from not quite having power.
And you're back with another book and with your co-author, a regular on our podcast.
Absolutely. My name's Gabriel Pogrund. I am the Whitehall editor at the Sunday Times. I, for better or worse, have a slightly broader beat than Patrick's. I'm less Keir Starmer correspondent, perhaps more mischief correspondent. I am there to subject politics to proper investigative reporting and occasionally tell you what they don't want you to know from within the corridors of power. Alongside Patrick, I wrote, as you mentioned, our last book on Corbyn, and we've written this new book, Get In, the inside story of Labour under Keir Starmer.
Well, with your tomes on Labour and what's really going on behind the scenes, you've sort of become a great double act. You're sort of like Brown and Blair before the rift. When did this start? What was your Grenadian moment?
More like Tweedledee and Tweedledum, but we
I wasn't going to say that.
Yeah.
When
Labour people have said worse privately. Yeah.
They will say worse when they read the book, I'm sure. But Patrick and I have been thick as thieves since we jointly edited the online student tabloid at UCL. So we actually met at a talk on campus with George Galloway. I should stress we were there in a purely journalistic capacity. We were both there to report for said tabloid, The Tab, and the rest is history.
And here you are, all these years later.
Here we are now, and actually in a moment of circularity or an early sign of the division of Labour or what we would end up doing. I remember Gabriel actually gave chase to George Galloway down a corridor and I stayed behind and wrote a smart aleck column about his waning political appeal, which turned out to be a great prediction given his many comebacks since. But there you go, Gabriel was always shoe leather and I was always scratching my chin.
And here you are in the newsroom of the Sunday Times and the Times. Tell us about this latest book, because your last one was the definitive read if you want to understand the Corbyn years. This is an amazing book. We're only 6 months really into a Starmer administration, yet it's full of scoops. We've got Labour changing, Corbyn leaving, Starmer taking over, changing the party overnight. And as you'd said right at the start, on election night, he's not there alone. There's a man by his side who has helped through a lot of this, Morgan McSweeney. Tell us a bit about him. Just give us a little pen portrait.
Morgan McSweeney was actually quite detached from SW1 before he mastered it. So he wasn't a character known to most people in Westminster. He was actually born in Ireland in a town in West Cork called Macroom. He moved to the UK in the 90s and joined New Labour because he was inspired by the Good Friday Agreement. But he never joined the list of individuals who, in many instances, became special advisors before going on to become MPs and ministers, the likes of Yvette Cooper, David Miliband, Ed Miliband. He actually had this quite lonely and unusual trajectory starting in the world of local government. He basically had been inspired by the Blairites, but wanted experience of politics at the grassroots level and went to work for Steve Reed, now the Environment Secretary, when his mission was not only to win power at the town hall in this borough in South London, but also to reform Labour locally, which had been run by Ted Knight, who was the sort of bogeyman of the tabloid press in the 70s. He was this iconic figure on the left who twinned the council with Nicaragua. He was basically the Corbyn before Corbyn. And in actual fact, Corbyn, when he was a trade unionist in Hornsey, was the election agent to Ted Knight. Ted Knight, having been distracted by ideology and the exotic causes of the progressive far left, he ended up missing what was happening underneath the surface, which was this prolific child abuse scandal within the precinct of his borough. And McSweeney's view was that there was essentially a direct line between the indulgence of left-wing politics and the outcome of children being abused and mutilated. And he does have this driving force, which is this idea that Labour is nothing unless it represents the hopes and aspirations of the working class and represents what ordinary, real-life human beings think, as opposed to what the left in London think. And he, around the time of Corbyn's leadership, was considering what could be done to restore Labour as the party of ordinary people, and he saw Keir Starmer as his vessel, as his vehicle for doing that.
So opposed to the ideology of the Corbyn left, much more a centrist, pragmatic character.
What's also interesting about Morgan McSweeney's political adolescence and his backstory is that he's sent out into the country as an election organiser just at the point that the public is falling out of love with Tony Blair. So the first by-election he ever organises is in Brent East, where people kick back against the Iraq War and elect a Liberal Democrat. He's in London in 2005 when the Tories sweep the board in Hammersmith, where he was organising. You know, when he's organising in Lambeth, that's the only council Labour gain that evening. His diagnosis is, yes, that we can't up with the hard left, we will not put, but it's also a very nuanced understanding of New Labour has lost touch with the public as well. He went to Barking and Dagenham in the far east of London and saw the rise of the BNP.
I was an organiser in Barking and Dagenham in 2008, and we were fighting the BNP. There was no part of the Labour Party that had foreseen the challenges the BNP would bring, how to defeat them. We were a party that was set up to defeat the Tories in marginal parliamentary seats. Not defeat the BNP and Labour heartlands.
You know, a lot of debate as to whether Morgan McSweeney was solely responsible for Labour's defeat of them. I don't think that's quite true, but he developed, as Gabriel says, that understanding that New Labour, or what wasn't then called the Corbynite left, if they are speaking down to or trying to impose their values or lecturing voters, it won't work.
The Labour Party has always been a party that has brought traditions together. Our labour unionist tradition, our radical socialist tradition, our reforming social democrat tradition. But too often and for too long, these traditions are in a state of angry estrangement.
That sort of gave him that grounding is what he took into the Labour leadership election of 2020 that Keir Starmer won, sort of by taking the electorate as they are and speaking to what they wanted to hear.
So that's sort of his worldview. What makes him such a significant character? What makes him such a player in Westminster?
Let's be clear about what endeared him to Keir Starmer and why it is that he ended up in this role of significance, such that, as Patrick was saying, on election night, it was Keir Starmer, Keir Starmer's wife, and Morgan McSweeney in a lift at the Tate. It is that he had an ability to read politics, possibly born of his detachment from it, that those in the Labour Party in Westminster didn't. So there are a lot of people who, between the years 2015 and 2019, thought that Labour might be a spent force. And it's funny, McSweeney shared a lot of the parliamentary Labour Party's revulsion for the hard left, but I don't think he necessarily shared their hysteria. And while a lot of people saw Parliament as the place from which that change would emerge, he always felt that Corbyn was doomed to fail, that he would in the end have this reckoning with the electorate, and that the key question was what happened immediately thereafter. What anybody who wanted to run Labour and seize it back from the left needed to do was be ready on the other side. And sometimes the most difficult thing to do in politics is to view it clearly. And what he did was essentially he did a lot of very expensive polling to determine what members wanted to hear. And he's insistent now that he offered that insight to a lot of people. But basically, he ended up building the closest relationship with Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer ended up profiting very handsomely from the research that he did.
That's the key thing. What did Morgan McSweeney have that others in the Labour Party didn't, and what made him so indispensable to Keir Starmer? He had time. You know, he was running an organisation called Labour Together, quite shadowy at the time. Actually, even its name was a bit of a deception because it really existed to divide the Labour membership from Jeremy Corbyn and the left of the Labour Party. And he had money from the donors he could convince that they should save the Labour Party. And he had that polling, the most detailed ever done of the Labour membership. It's like an MRI scan of the Labour membership and what they really think. It's those three things that made him indispensable to Keir Starmer. And people, when he was first invited into Keir Starmer's inner circle in 2019, the summer of 2019, it was a very close-knit circle. They used to meet on Monday mornings at the Camden house of Jenny Chapman, which is on Arlington Road. So imaginatively, they gave themselves the code name, the Arlington Group. And one day, Keir Starmer is walking from Mornington Crescent Tube with Chris Ward, the first aide he ever hired. And he and Chris Ward, since 2015, have been speaking every week about something they call the project. The project is the project to make Keir Starmer leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister. But they don't really understand the membership. So they're walking to Jenny Chapman's house and Keir Starmer turns to Chris Ward and says, we're going to meet someone new today. And Chris Ward says, who? And Keir Starmer says, well, it's this chap called Morgan McSweeney. He's going to do a presentation for us. And Chris Ward says, I don't know. All I know about this Morgan guy is that he ran Liz Kendall's campaign in 2015 and she got 4.5% of the vote. What could he possibly teach us? And so they go and they sit in Jenny Chapman's kitchen, and Morgan McSweeney gives one of his characteristic PowerPoints full of weird and wonderful visual metaphors, Star Wars and Roman soldiers and all of that sort of thing. And they walk out, eventually, Keir Starmer and Chris Ward. And he turns to Chris Ward with a grin on his face. He said, I told you he was good. And thus began the working relationship that has really defined the past 5 years of British politics and has remade the mainstream left in Britain.
So that's how it begins in 2019. How key is Morgan McSweeney to what then becomes the Starmer project? Could that election have been won without him?
Starmer is in some ways a apolitical figure. There are times in this book where his politics are conspicuous by their absence. I don't want to just say he lacks politics in terms of he lacks ideology, but he's not necessarily that interested in the practice of politics or the art of politics. He's bored and possibly confounded by the social complexities and nuances of life in the Parliamentary Labour Party. He loathes nothing more than the idea of fraternising with MPs he doesn't actually know in the tea room. We spoke to Martin Plout, a journalist and friend of his from his constituency, who said that he is the least clubbable man you're ever going to see in Westminster. And so, in some ways, that was Starmer's great strength, was he hadn't overly committed to any one tendency within the party. He did travel light ideologically, but there was no doubt he was incomplete politically when he assumed the leadership. Patrick and I have spent a lot of time reconstructing what happened at the imaginatively named Arlington Group, and there was this one session, in fact the very first session in 2019, at which Starmer's principal concern, it has been said to us, was who was taking notes and whether the agenda items were being adhered to properly.
Or whether they'd be compliant with financial regulations or trade union law. And he declined to chair the first meeting of his own leadership campaign. And that's a great metaphor for the way politics in the Labour Party works over the subsequent 5 years, because having written a book about Jeremy Corbyn, who was so often a felt absence in a story that was about aides with strong wills and personality, we started this project and said, well, look, at least we're not going to write another book where the leader is a bit of a vacuum at the centre of it. And while that's not quite true of Keir Starmer, it's certainly true that often he feels incidental or detached from, or the very last step that anybody takes in implementing a political decision, or the politics happens in spite of him or around him or over his head or under his nose. And it's only at the last moment he comes to appreciate it or comes to understand it. So many of the problems the Labour Party has and the rows the Labour Party has in this period are consequences of Keir Starmer not engaging in day-to-day politics, and leaving decisions are deferred or tensions rise because you don't have a leader who's coming in every morning like Tony Blair and saying, bang, 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 this is what we're going to achieve today, or a Margaret Thatcher character. So, yeah, I'd say that's one of the big takeaways and why Morgan McSweeney assumes such huge power and essentially becomes the sort of Prime Minister to Keir Starmer's constitutional monarch within the Labour Party, because the politics certainly isn't coming from Keir Starmer most of the time.
So Morgan McSweeney is absolutely key to the Starmer project. Without him, Starmer would probably have given up a while ago. What does McSweeney really think of Starmer, though?
There is something unknowable about Morgan McSweeney's relationship with Keir Starmer. They're not friends in the way that aides who work closely together with leaders often become friends or parts of the family. Starmer's original team was sort of a team of friends, and one by one he either sacked them or they left of their own accord because they became so frustrated. Morgan McSweeney's one of two people who's seen the whole thing through from opposition to government. And what's strange about that is that they're not friends. They don't share a worldview, i.e. Keir Starmer is certainly more left-wing than Morgan McSweeney is. on most questions. And at times, Morgan McSweeney doesn't speak publicly, but there's a small circle of people from whom he takes advice, to whom he vents or shares ideas and thoughts and uses as a sounding board. And there have been times we spoke to a lot of those people in some detail. There have been moments where Morgan McSweeney questioned whether Keir Starmer could keep up with the pace of the change he was demanding, whether he necessarily had the stomach for the fight ahead. There's one line quoted by one of Morgan McSweeney's intimates, one of his inner circle: Keir acts like a HR manager, not a leader. Another is, what's the point of circling the wagons if you can't last?
I mean, that's all quite damning. The idea of an HR manager rather than a leader isn't really what you want in a Prime Minister.
And look, it's reflective of the way this whole project has been set up, i.e. the politics comes from somewhere else. Keir Starmer has, in effect, subcontracted his politics to Morgan McSweeney and the right of the Labour Party. And often that works because if you were looking at it positively, Keir Starmer is a delegator. He doesn't necessarily sweat the small stuff like Rishi Sunak or Gordon Brown or Theresa May. He's content to let competent people get on with their jobs. But when it's something as essential as, what is this political project? Who is the Labour Party for? What is the political sort of North Star that informs every single one of the decisions we take, even if it's a knotty policy decision? If Keir Starmer isn't providing that, then it becomes and has become and became very frustrating for people under him at points. And I think that's one of the main takeaways of the book. And there is a sort of awareness on the part of some of Keir Starmer's advisors that is the way things work. You get various shades of loyalty from people when you're speaking to them very privately and very candidly about this project. But a lot of the time you speak to people and it's clear their ultimate loyalty is to Morgan McSweeney and not Keir Starmer. And these are people working for Keir Starmer's government.
Wow.
In the words of one advisor who was working for Keir Starmer or worked for Keir Starmer, there's the immortal line in the book, Keir Starmer is not driving the train. He thinks he's driving the train, but we've sat him at the front of the DLR. Now, if you're not in London and you don't take the Docklands Light Railway, the DLR does not have a driver. So you can sit at the front and pretend to drive it if you really want.
Lots of children do exactly that.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it's not a flattering comparison. HR manager, child sat at the front of a driverless train. And it should be said, let's put these in context. These are people venting. These are people speaking at their lowest moments. Politics is a rough and dispiriting trade. But, many a true word said in anger.
Gabriel and Patrick, you've been telling us how in your book you describe the relationship between Keir Starmer, who's not a naturally political politician, and his reliance on Morgan McSweeney. Somebody around him, somebody in the cabinet who is, though, is Angela Rayner. Tell us about her.
She is one of the protagonists of this book, as you'd expect, and you couldn't imagine a more different person and politician to Keir Starmer than Angela Rayner, as they themselves, well, Angela more than Keir certainly, are very, very open about. She likens it to an arranged marriage.
I wouldn't say we're friends, but we're friendly. I have a professional relationship with Keir. I have a warm relationship with him, and I have a frank conversation with him when we disagree on issues, but we're just totally different in the way we approach, a problem, or we approach that, the way in which we work.
This story, I think, is punctuated with Angela Rayner asserting herself in unlikely scenarios, or scenarios where the voice in Angela Rayner's head might tell her, someone like you, having to overcome that sort of sense of self-doubt. And that's one of the things we've discovered about Angela Rayner writing this book, I think, is that while she projects an image of extreme self-confidence, nonchalance, insouciance, that sort of thing, she is a politician, as you'd expect from a woman of her background, racked by doubt and racked by uncertainty.
If I'm going to a high-level meeting, then I prepare for a high-level meeting. If I'm going to my local butcher's, I'll prepare for my local butcher's, but it's always me,
Yeah.
And I think you just have to be authentically you. And one of the things that I've always said is because of my background, I tend to over-prepare, because I don't go into anything thinking, I know everything.
Which is only exacerbated by the way she's treated by the Labour leadership. the pivot points on which the history of this period turns is the Hartlepool by-election. And Keir Starmer's team conclude that Angela Rayner needs to be demoted within the shadow cabinet. Angela Rayner fights back and proves that she is a politician who is not to be messed with or condescended to or talked down to. And similarly, there are so many other moments in this story where Angela Rayner finds herself saying no, or I'm not going to put up with this, to very powerful men who might look down their nose at Angela Rayner. Everybody from the royal family, or rather the sort of the British deep state when they're considering, in the wake of the Queen's death, who gets to be a councillor of state to the king, i.e. one of his designated deputies who can sign bills into law and a whole range of other constitutional functions in the absence of the monarch. Prince Andrew was meant to be on that list. Angela Rayner, in the words of one of her inner circle, has a very stereotypical working class view of this thing, which is she loves the monarchy, but she doesn't like a pedo. And given everything we know about Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein, was determined to ensure that there was no circumstance under which Prince Andrew was allowed to represent the king formally. You know, at one stage, she is alleged, or rather aides who were in the room for this dramatic arrival found her returning from a meeting and saying, I'm not going to vote to keep that nonce on.
That meeting, by the way, was a Microsoft Teams call with the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case.
Wow.
So Patrick talked about her willingness to say the unsayable to men who were born to rule. You won't have a more vivid illustration of that tendency than in that moment.
What is she like up close?
I think she's the closest thing to an ordinary person you'll meet in politics. I don't mean ordinary as a sort of pejorative. I mean, she is just a fully formed human being. And often as journalists, when you meet politicians, you get a palpable sense of they're holding something back. When you see Keir Starmer, when he's doing the rounds at lobby drinks for Westminster journalists, you can tell he's clenching his teeth and he's basically hating every second of it, and he is digging deep into his well of small talk. Whereas, you know, on the occasions I've met Angela Rayner, and I won't claim that that's regularly or that we're best buds, because we're not, and I've met her a few times, but I think she's one of the only politicians that's ever given me a hug. After I did a quiz with her once, she gave me a hug, and that's classic Angela Rayner. But you know, she is an important part of this story because she's a reminder that power alone is not concentrated in the hands of Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney, that the Labour Party is a more complicated organism than they think. And also Keir Starmer always needs Angela Rayner. I think it's easy to forget that. There have been times when Keir Starmer has needed something, and who's the person he goes to get him out of a hole? It's Angela Rayner. Be that when he was trying to appoint a general secretary, i.e. the Labour Party's chief executive very early on, and the unions were going to vote against him and install a candidate of the left, and he thought, hang on, me and Morgan McSweeney, or rather Morgan McSweeney thought, I need to reform the party from the inside out. I can't do that with a sort of left-aligned person. What does he do? He gets Keir Starmer to ring Angela Rayner and say, please, I just need this. And Angela Rayner does it for him. Similarly, when during the election campaign, there's a huge row between the Labour leadership and Diane Abbott after somebody briefed her, to me, actually, that they were going to ban her from standing. And that blew up a deal that was been struck between Keir Starmer and Diane Abbott, and there was this long standoff that was derailing Labour's election campaign. What does Keir Starmer do? He says to Angela Rayner, please, 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 can you get me off this hook? And what does Angela Rayner do? She goes on television and says,
I don't see any reason why Diane Abbott can't stand as a Labour MP going forward. She's been cleared as part of an investigation. That is a process. I'm not involved in that process. And for me, I just see that if she wants to stand, then I don't see any reason why she can't stand.
And within 24 hours, that's happened. So she is so much more important than I think people give her credit for. And she is a savvy politician and a really, really compelling character.
Gabriel, she's clearly a very effective politician. Could she have launched a coup against Keir Starmer? Could she be the one running the party right now?
It depends on who you ask. We write in the book that there was no such thing as Angela Rayner. There was the Angela Rayner of her parliamentary advisors, those who sought to use her as a way of dominating the Labour Party politically, people who ate, slept and breathed Labour politics, who thought because of her trade union links and her status within the parliamentary Labour Party, that she could be used to command all she surveyed within Labour. There was the Angela Rayner of the left, so there was a time when everyone from John McDonnell to her flatmate Becky Long-Bailey thought that Rayner, either as potential deputy leader or leader, could be used to maintain the left's chokehold on the party. And then there's Angela Rayner herself, who, as Patrick said, is this very compelling character. She brings this levity and self-deprecation to what she does. She's referred to herself as the vape dragon, owing to her occasional enjoyment of a single-use vape. She's very normal. She likes shoes. She likes DJing. She likes parties. She's not afraid to say so.
You're a politician that in many ways is out of the mould. You know, people have got lots to say about you. You were pictured recently in Ibiza looking like you were living your best life.
Well, I say that people on holiday are on holiday. I had a couple of days. People deserve to have downtime as well, and I won't apologise for occasionally. I mean, I can apologise for my dance moves. They're not to everyone's taste.
We can all apologise for our dance moves.
At times, it's difficult to know which Angela Rayner you're going to get, or which Angela Rayner ends up rising to the surface in a given confrontation. And the bust-up after the Hartlepool by-election, where Starmer stripped her of the party chairmanship, is a good illustration of there being competing Angela Rayners. So we spoke to a very close confidant of hers who is adamant that Rayner had a rally of 5,000 people ready to go, that they were prepared to launch a coup, that had Starmer not stepped back from the brink and essentially offered her any combination of roles she liked, short of the one she'd had before alongside her deputy leadership, that they were ready to reunite the trade union movement with the parliamentary left, with the membership, and stage the ultimate comeback and fulfil the ambition that had been dashed when she agreed that Becky Long-Bailey could run as the left candidate back in 2019, 2020. So
They would have put her in power.
it is claimed, but then it's actually quite difficult to know, because Rayner has also been a very steadfast supporter and ally of Starmer's, notwithstanding her occasional frustrations. We talked about the fact that she's a normal person, and after that confrontation, she went where else but the pub to cool off. And that is one of the things which is quite refreshing about her as a character to write about, where you don't need to guess how she felt in a given moment, because when you speak to people around her and say, what did she do? They say, well, she effed off to the pub. And we cogitated about what to do next over pints. And
She's clearly very compelling as a personality in politics because she seems so human. She's not an HR manager in the style of Keir Starmer, as Morgan McSweeney put it. What does she think of Starmer?
I think there are two sort of slightly contradictory factors at play here. The first is that she, for a long time, and at intervals, and the people around her are paranoid, sometimes with justification, about how she is perceived. They know, with some justification, that people around Keir Starmer might take a dim view of her. One Morgan McSweeney line to one of his confidants is, Angela is political all the time. She manipulates people. Her aides are very political, that sort of thing. So they're very aware of that perception. I mean, we talk about one trip to the pub Angela Rayner took in 2023. And as late as 2023, she's saying, Keir Starmer's going to sack me. The people around Keir Starmer, the right-wingers around Keir Starmer are going to sack me. They'll abolish the deputy leadership. They don't want me here. She texted a friend at one point after the Hartlepool by-election in despair and said words to the effect of, I'd love to know who runs the Labour Party, because it isn't Keir Starmer. He can't run a bath. But also at the same time, by the way, people around Keir Starmer are paranoid about Angela Rayner. They're fearful of Angela Rayner. That quote from Morgan McSweeney, quoted by a friend, is such a key point. He is aware that Angela Rayner has a political skill set, and they often see malign motive where none exists. So it's that sort of mutual suspicion and enmity, but nonetheless those energies are often devoted to productive ends as well.
By the way, on that point of paranoia, I mean, it is always there. After the Queen's death, the late Queen Elizabeth II's death, the Labour leadership were required to nominate a list of senior parliamentarians who would swear their oath of allegiance anew to the new crown, to the new monarch, Charles, in the House of Commons. And Rayner was left off that list. And it's amazing to think at the time she was shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. She's deputy leader of the Labour Party. She was responsible for a wide array of policies and symbolically fulfilled all these roles within Labour. But she was furious and a little devastated to be left off this list and threatened to storm out of Parliament and went back up to her office to collect her bags after learning that no, the leader's office hadn't made a mistake. They did genuinely mean to exclude her from this list of frontbenchers and party bigwigs who were being called upon to represent the Labour Party in this moment of great constitutional import. And I think, it's not just Starmer, it's even the royals themselves. There's this it's amazingly awkward line where her and Camilla, the future Queen, were at a reception in Clarence House in 2022. And I think that Rana was a bit bewildered that Camilla's opening line was, well, you look a lot younger in person than you do on TV.
Is that a compliment? I can't decide.
Well, that's what we couldn't decide. So we just decided to report it. But you never quite know. Does the establishment, the British establishment, the establishment of the Labour Party, fully trust her? And you don't quite know whether she fully trusts them. And that has continued into government, but is a sort of through line across Starmer's time in opposition as well.
And you can sort of see why the establishment would sort of view her with some suspicion. You do have some great anecdotes of how she approaches diplomacy, for example, which I imagine would probably have rattled cages in the Foreign Office.
Or, they would have praised her realpolitik and way of disarming people. Again, this goes to show Angela Rayner is, as a people person and someone who understands the human side of politics, is very valued by the leadership of the Labour Party when they need her. After the October the 7th attacks and when the politics of the Middle East returned with a vengeance to halt the Labour Party, Angela Rayner spent a lot of time with ambassadors from the Gulf, sort of leading Labour's response and sort of canvassing views. And there's a line quoted by one attendee of those meetings where she jokingly, to sort of lighten the mood or, speak directly to the Saudi ambassador, said, "You need to stop chopping people's heads off and then we can talk." Again, taken in very good humour. She also used to joke that the Saudi envoy wanted to marry her. She used to
maybe in a joke, may not.
It's just that sort of very plain speaking, straightforward way of dealing with people that is quite a sharp contrast to Keir Starmer.
Completely different.
Yeah, you can't imagine Keir Starmer saying that in a meeting. If Keir Starmer veers off the minutes in a meeting, I think it's a national crisis, whereas Angela Rayner is quite happy to sort of call a spade a spade. And that's a quality people around her really admire as a sort of counterpoint to Keir Starmer.
So given that you've got a very political deputy prime minister, a prime minister who really isn't political at all, you have a sense of paranoia amongst the administration, no great loyalty to Keir Starmer necessarily. How long do you think he can last?
I think that what we've learned is that there's not a deep wellspring of enthusiasm or good faith towards Starmer personally, not least when he is seen to deviate from those handful of things that he said he would do. There's quite a fragile contract that he has with the public, and so it's quite easy to say what the circumstances are in which he might lose an election. I will say, though, that for all of the what-ifs that we examine in the book, his status within the party is cemented for now. And for all Rayner's moments of human, real sincere anger and disappointment at the way she's been treated, he is safe as leader for his first term. I can't see that changing. I don't know if Patrick agrees.
Whatever happens, we'll tell the story in the third book, which, I think we were resisting. But hey, if people want to commission us to write a third book, I suppose we'll have to and finish the story of Labour in government, if it only lasts 5 years. Look, I think the key thing about this entire period is, what does Keir Starmer do in 2019? Ask Morgan McSweeney to make him leader of the Labour Party. What does Keir Starmer ask Morgan McSweeney to do in October 2024 after he's had to sack Sue Gray? He asked Morgan McSweeney to run the country for him. If that contract ever expires or is breached by one of them, I think that's the point at which there's a serious discussion about Keir Starmer's future. Are Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney the same project? Is there a Starmer project and a McSweeney project existing that have converged and may yet diverge? That, I think, is the defining question. It's certainly too early for them to diverge now, but who knows? In the future, that's something people talk about sotto voce.
My only little note, perhaps a postscript, is that in the interest of humility, I must say that we concluded in our last tome that Corbyn had permanently re-sculpted the Labour Party, that he had recreated it in his image, that the left had set the terms of conversation indefinitely, and that the Labour Party would never go back to Blair or Blairism.
I wasn't actually going to hold you to account for that, but yes, that was
You mean you forgot that line?
a slight failure.
Yes.
Corbynism is here to stay. And in a way it was, but, not in the Labour Party. This time I think we've shied away from making a bold, declarative claim in our epilogue. All we've said is Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney have renewed their contract, and let's see how that goes for them.
That was Patrick Maguire, political columnist at The Times, and his co-author of Get In, the inside story of Labour under Starmer, Gabriel Pogrund, Whitehall editor for The Sunday Times. You can read extracts from their book at thetimes.com with a subscription, and you can pre-order a copy now ahead of publication next week from The Times Bookshop. We'll put a link in the description of this episode. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.